Jinkies! I find it hard to believe that Scooby-Doo moment was a coincidence. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today we're going to be continuing my Conjuring universe review series with the 2019 supernatural horror film, The Curse of La Llorona. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Curse of La Llorona stars Linda Cardellini, Roman Christou, and Jaynee-Lynn Kinchen, and was directed by Michael Chaves. Set in 1973, it tells the story of Anna, played by Linda Cardellini, who must prevent La Llorona from stealing her children. The Curse of La Llorona is a bit of an outlier in the Conjuring universe. Of all the spin-off films we've gotten so far, it's the only one whose subject didn't make an appearance in one of the core Conjuring films. The first Conjuring gave us Annabelle, and The Conjuring 2 gave us The Nun, as well as The Crooked Man, whose own film is rumored to be in development. But La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, was completely new for the franchise. And not only that, but this film's connection to the Conjuring universe was actually kept under wraps for quite some time, being revealed as a bit of a surprise shortly before release. I think a big part of the reason for that was because the connection to the universe is pretty tenuous. The only other film it directly references is Annabelle, featuring one character who overlaps, but it's a fairly minor connection that doesn't play a big role in the plot. And so we have this extra story that kinda stands apart and doesn't directly connect to the Warrens, at least as of right now. So rather than pulling from their case files, this film draws upon Mexican folklore. Now, I know a lot of people grew up with this folktale, but this movie was actually my first introduction to the story, and I found it to be a really interesting myth. So, this movie's limited connection to the rest of the Conjuring universe, as well as its folklore origins, were different for the franchise, but they're not the only reasons it's a bit of an outlier. This movie has a very different tone from the rest of the universe films. The others have all taken a fairly straightforward horror approach. There's been quite a bit of variation there, but they're all easy to classify as horror, or at least attempting to be horror. The Curse of La Llorona is billed as a horror movie, and definitely thinks it's a horror movie, but I was surprised to find that this plays out much more like a mystery thriller than anything else. And I found that sort of mystery element to be really interesting. Like I said, I personally didn't know anything about La Llorona, but neither did our main characters at the start of the movie, so I felt like I was uncovering and discovering all these things with them. I imagine people who grew up with the folktale, though, won't have quite that same experience here. There were definitely some weak points in the plot, and quite a few plot threads that get dropped, but I found the story to be pretty compelling. Where this film really struggled, though, was the horror. Like I said, this movie wants to be a horror movie, but is structured more like a mystery thriller, so the scary moments don't end up being all that scary. And I can understand how that could be super disappointing if you went into this fully expecting it to be a scary horror film. But personally, after the first Annabelle movie, I adjusted my scare expectations for these spin-offs and didn't anticipate this one to be scary going into it. And it's not for the most part. Unfortunately, it does make use of an abundance of jump scares, but for some reason, they didn't really bother me as much here as they did in some of the other spin-offs. And I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it's because I was so wrapped up in the story itself, but I think it might actually be because the scares felt like an extra component of the movie, rather than the core of it that everything else had to hinge on. So, because I was viewing it as a supernatural thriller instead of as a horror film, the scare issues didn't seem to be as big of a deal. The same thing goes for La Llorona herself, too. Mostly. In terms of creepiness, she's definitely the worst of the spin-off characters. Seeing her face doesn't induce the same instant dread that the Nun or even Annabelle do. But just like with the jump scares, almost all of which accompany her, by the way, I didn't really mind the character. Mostly because I viewed her as the subject of a mystery rather than a big horror villain. I will say, though, that the crying got old really fast, but she's literally the weeping woman, so it kinda comes with the territory. So the scares might not really be there, but you know who is? Linda Cardellini. She's another reason this movie's an outlier. Other than Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, I haven't really found any of the acting in the Conjuring universe to stand out all that much. It's usually pretty good, but nothing amazing. But Linda Cardellini was great in this movie. At first I thought it was kind of weird that she had agreed to star in this movie, but she fits perfectly and really elevates it. Despite all the crazy and at times ridiculous things going on in this film, she feels like a very real character who has reasonable responses to things. There's this one scene where she encounters La Llorona for the first time, and her first instinct is to go get a weapon. So with La Llorona on the other side of a locked door, she gets a bat, turns to go back towards the door, and finds herself face to face with La Llorona, who materialized in the room. And Cardellini lets out this startled scream yell that's just so real for the situation, and not like a typical horror movie scream. So despite all of its differences, I think The Curse of La Llorona fits right in with the rest of the Conjuring universe films. It's got the realistic, emotional core to it that helped to make the central Conjuring film so good. And after The Nun was a bit disappointing on this front, I was really happy to find that this film was a return to form for the cinematography. Bet you thought I was going to forget to talk about it this time, huh? But really, this one brings back the great long tracking shots, but also makes really interesting use of reflections. Mirrors, swimming pools, tear puddles. If it can reflect something, it's prominently featured here. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is definitely Linda Cardellini. She's perfectly cast as a mom from the 70s. It sounds weird, but I couldn't get over how well she fit in the era. Her demeanor, how she looked, it was spot on. And on top of that, she fits the character really well, bringing this believability to a frequently unbelievable supernatural movie. You felt for her regarding her protectiveness of her kids, the emotional challenges she was facing with work, and even just her responses to all the crazy stuff that was happening. I imagine her past work with the Mystery Inc. gang helped her out on that front. The second pro is the story, or at least most of the story. Things get a little iffy by the end, and there's this weird vindictive subplot that feels pretty forced, but I found the rest of it to be really interesting and pretty compelling. Again, part of that's likely because the folktale of La Llorona was completely new to me, so I was really drawn into the setup and wanted to know more and see how it played out. But I also really liked the mystery thriller approach that much of this movie had, and also appreciated the surprising moments of humor, mostly delivered by Raymond Cruz. On the con side, the biggest issue here has gotta be the scares, or lack thereof. When viewing this film as more of a thriller, it's really not all that bad when it comes to scares, but if you think of it as a straight-up horror movie, it'll be kinda disappointing. Unfortunately, like basically all of the spin-off films, this one's loaded with jump scares. There are a few more traditionally tense scares too, but most of the horror moments here are startling rather than scary. The second con is La Llorona. The concept of this character is pretty silly when you think about it, so I can't really fault the film here for some of the traits we see, like the incessant crying. But I gotta say, I was disappointed by her lack of creepiness, both in terms of her looks and also her movement. The only creepy thing she ever did was suddenly appear someplace. I mean, I don't think the design was horrible, but she certainly didn't leave the same haunting impression on me that the Nun or Annabelle did. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying The Curse of La Llorona, or any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give The Curse of La Llorona 3 out of 5 paws. This was a bit of a pleasant surprise for me amid the very hit-or-miss spin-offs. It definitely has its problems, but an interesting story and a strong performance by Linda Cardellini really elevated this one. I would recommend The Curse of La Llorona to fans of the Conjuring universe or people who want a decent horror-tinged supernatural mystery thriller. It doesn't have a ton of direct connections within the universe, but still ties in and has a very familiar feel. I get the feeling that people who grew up with the La Llorona story might not find this as interesting as I did, but for newcomers to the myth, you might also find it to be a mostly compelling mystery. If you liked The Curse of La Llorona, I would recommend The Conjuring. Not only was this the fantastically crafted film that kicked this franchise off, but it also featured 2 very strong female performances and had prominent mother-child elements to its horror. If you want another horror film that features an overly maternal supernatural creature, you should definitely watch Mama. It also has some strong mystery aspects to it, and is quite a bit creepier than this movie. And if you like the use of reflections here, you might want to check out Oculus. Synopsis, which is a very unique mirror-based horror film. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Curse of La Llorona? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite horror movie based on a folktale? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.